For the latest on the ground in Ukraine, we cross live to our regional correspondent, Gulliver Cragg, in the capital, Kyiv. Gulliver, how has the Ukrainian government been reacting to Putin's speech?
Well, President Volodymyr Zelensky convened an emergency meeting of the National Security and Defense Council. That meeting is still ongoing. The Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council just appeared for a very brief briefing because they were very late in terms of the time that they had said that they would come out. But he just came out to say the meeting was still ongoing, that the president would soon be speaking publicly, and also that Ukraine considered its territory to still include those areas of Donetsk and Luhansk and, of course, Crimea as well. So clearly a statement of defiance. This is a country, I think, somewhat in shock after that speech by Vladimir Putin. I mean, you might say that we knew he thought a lot of these things, which most Ukrainians consider to be basically completely incompatible with reality, a completely skewed interpretation of history, a characterization of Ukraine as being governed by nationalists or even fascists, all kinds of factual untruths that were in those speech, because he did write these kinds of things in an essay that was published last summer. But the way that the speech was so entirely focused on Ukraine as a whole, on questioning Ukraine's right to exist in general, and actually so little devoted to the Donbass, that has sent shivers down the spine of many Ukrainians.
Well, let's turn now to the violence in eastern Ukraine. Moscow and Kyiv have been trading accusations, each saying the other side is responsible for the intensifying shelling in recent days. What's the situation on the ground there?
Well, shelling continued today. The Ukrainian armed forces say that four of their servicemen have been wounded today. No one was killed, but one civilian was killed in Novoluhansk, which is a small town very, very close to the front line. Perhaps the shelling was a little bit less intense this Monday than it has been in previous days. This uptick in violence basically started on Thursday, but there was an intensification of the information war in terms of the accusations flying in Ukraine's direction from Russia, with the Russians accusing Ukraine of sending forces actually over the border, of sending rockets over the border, all things which Ukraine strenuously denies and for which Russia was able to offer no convincing evidence. Meanwhile, Ukraine actually accused the Russian-backed separatists of shelling their own capital, Luhansk, one of their two capitals, from their own territory, but very, very close to Ukrainian territory, in order to blame the Ukrainians. There was also an explosion in the center of Luhansk where a car was blown up. All sorts of violent incidents that mainly looked as though they were designed to try to back up Russia's claim that Ukraine is at the origin of this violence, which Ukraine strenuously denies. And I do think that at the moment, the way things are with this speech of Putin's, which seemed to have been prepared a long time in advance, just as his meeting of the National Security Council seems to have been prepared a long time in advance, and it all does seem to have been coordinated. If you look back at the broader picture, even though we can't be on the ground to prove who is shooting first, Ukraine's incentive to escalate the violence at this stage, when there are all these Russian forces just outside its borders, and when the whole world is fearing a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Ukraine has been saying for months now that its main task is to not give in to Russian provocations, it does seem very implausible that Ukraine would actually be at the origin of this violence. And that, of course, leaves Ukraine in a very difficult position, because there was this threat from Vladimir Putin that if the violence continues, there will be severe consequences, and Ukraine will be to blame for the bloodshed. Ukraine's position is that it is already not to blame for the bloodshed, and that it's coming from the Russian side, and the Russian side shows no intention of changing tack.